August 1969. The air in Benedict Canyon was thick and still, heavy with the scent of jasmine and the dry California heat that lingered long after the sun went down. Inside the house on Cielo Drive, the evening was unfolding like any other, a small gathering of friends. The low murmur of conversation, the clinking of ice in glasses. Outside, the world was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels absolute. A blanket over the Hollywood Hills. No one inside that house knew that the silence was a lie. That, beyond the gate, in the darkness, a different kind of quiet was gathering. A patient, predatory quiet. A quiet that was about to break. The house itself sat at the end of a long, winding private road. It was isolated, which was part of its appeal, a retreat from the noise of the city below. But that isolation had two sides. It offered privacy, but it also offered concealment for anyone who didn't belong there. In the weeks leading up to that night, there had been small, unsettling occurrences. A stranger showing up at the gate, looking for someone who no longer lived there. A phone line that seemed to go dead for a few minutes before inexplicably working again. Items moved just slightly from where they were left. These were the kinds of things you dismiss. Tricks of the light, slips of memory. The rational mind explains them away, because the alternative is too difficult to consider. The idea that someone is watching, cataloging your movements, learning the layout of your life from a distance. The people who came that night were not a gang in the traditional sense. They were something else. A collection of lost souls, held together by a single, charismatic figure who preached a twisted philosophy of chaos and liberation. They saw themselves as instruments of a coming storm, and they had been sent to deliver a message written in fear. They had visited the house before, during the day. They knew the terrain. They had seen the open windows, the unlocked doors, the casual trust of people who felt safe in their own home. They moved with a strange, rehearsed purpose, their movements quiet and deliberate as they cut the phone lines and scaled the fence, melting into the shadows of the property. They weren't just intruders. They were invaders from a different reality. One where the rules of civilized society had been completely discarded. The first person they encountered was a young man in his car, just leaving the guest house. He was just a visitor, a friend of the groundskeeper. He didn't understand what was happening. He pleaded with them, telling them he wouldn't say anything. His confusion was met with a cold, detached violence. It was the opening act. Inside the main house, the occupants were unaware. The sounds from outside were muffled by the distance and the thick walls. The night was still young. The attackers slipped inside through an unlocked window. The interior of the house was dark, with only a few lamps casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. For a moment, they just stood there, letting their eyes adjust. Figures of pure blackness against the dim light. The peaceful home had become a cage, and its residents were now trapped with the hunters. What followed was not a robbery or a crime of passion. It was a ritual. The intruders woke the sleeping occupants one by one. There was confusion, then disbelief, then a slow-dawning terror of the situation. The leader of the group, a man with a chillingly calm demeanor, uttered a simple, horrifying phrase. "I'm the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business." The words hung in the air, a declaration that all hope was gone. The violence was methodical, brutal, and impersonal. The victims weren't individuals to them. They were symbols. The attackers used knives, not just to kill, but to desecrate. To leave a statement, they wrote words on the walls, using the blood of those they had just murdered. When they were finished, they stepped back out into the night, as quietly as they had arrived. The house on Cielo Drive fell silent once more, but this time it was a different kind of silence. A heavy, permanent silence, thick with the aftermath of unimaginable horror. The next morning, the housekeeper arrived to a scene that would defy description. The discovery sent a shockwave of fear through Los Angeles and the entire country. The police were baffled. The crime was so bizarre, so devoid of any traditional motive, that it seemed random, senseless. Who would do this, and why? In the initial confusion, theories flew. A drug deal gone wrong. A targeted hit. but nothing quite fit. The victims were well-known, successful people. They had no known enemies who would be capable of such an act. The sheer brutality of it all seemed to point away from professional criminals and toward something far more disturbing. It felt like an act of madness. The investigation stalled almost immediately. There were no clear suspects, no witnesses, and the crime scene itself was a chaotic mess that offered few solid clues. The city held its breath, wondering if the killers would strike again. And they did. The very next night, in a different part of the city, the group chose another house. Seemingly at random, they broke in and subjected another couple to the same ritualistic, savage violence. This second act of terror confirmed the city's worst fears. This wasn't an isolated incident. There was a force of pure, nihilistic violence loose in the hills. The two crimes, though clearly linked by their methods, only deepened the mystery. There was no connection between the victims. The only common thread was the unhinged brutality and the strange, cryptic messages left behind. The public was gripped by panic. Gun sales soared. People locked their doors and looked at their neighbors with suspicion. The feeling was that the fabric of society was tearing, that the darkness that had always been kept at bay was now walking freely among them. It took months for the investigation to finally find a foothold. The break came not from the crime scenes, but from an unrelated case involving car thefts and the arrest of a drifter who belonged to a strange commune living in the desert. While in custody, one of the group's members began to talk, boasting about the murders to a cell. The story that emerged was more bizarre than anyone could have imagined. It was a tale of a failed musician who had refashioned himself as a messiah, gathering a following of young, impressionable runaways. He controlled them completely, filling their heads with apocalyptic prophecies and convincing them that a violent, chaotic race war was imminent. A war he called Helter Skelter. He had ordered the murders to kickstart this apocalypse, hoping the authorities would blame other groups and ignite the conflict he so desperately wanted to see. The arrests brought a sense of relief, but the trial that followed was a media circus that only amplified the horror. The accused followers, particularly the young women, showed no remorse. They smiled, sang songs, and carved symbols into their foreheads in solidarity with their leader. They seemed to exist in a completely different moral universe, one where murder was an act of love and loyalty. Their testimony was chilling, a window into a world of total psychological manipulation. The leader himself was a master of performance, turning the courtroom into his stage, delivering rambling, incoherent speeches that were both pathetic and terrifying. In the end, they were all found guilty. Justice, it seemed, had been served. The legal chapter was closed, but for many, the story never truly ended. It left a permanent scar on the American psyche. It marked the end of an era, the death of the peace and love idealism of the 60s. The story became a modern fable, a cautionary tale about the darkness that can hide behind a charismatic smile. Even after the convictions, questions lingered. The official narrative seemed too neat for a crime that was anything but. And there was one detail, often overlooked in the chaos of the investigation, that never sat right. A pair of eyeglasses found at the first crime scene. They didn't belong to any of the victims, and according to testimony, they didn't belong to any of the attackers who were convicted. They were a hoose. They're an anomaly, a piece of the puzzle that never found its place. Whose were they? Were they simply dropped by an investigator, a forgotten mistake in a chaotic scene? Or were they left by someone else who was there that night, a shadow who slipped away unseen? Their role in the story forever unknown. The official record is closed, but the house on Cielo Drive is long gone, torn down to erase the memory. Yet, the question remains, hanging in the silence of the Hollywood Hills. Did they really catch everyone?